Wilson, and I want to welcome lots of regular nonfiction book participants today. And although HASP has rules, and of course, we're all good rule followers, actually, talking about books, it just slows the process down if you have to be unmuted and recognized. So my suggestion is that just unmute yourself, and Norma Kilalea is going to lead us in a discussion today of this wonderful book. I hope you all enjoyed it, When Time Stopped. But just please follow Norma's lead. And if you have a question or a comment, it's fine. I mean, our nonfiction book group is very compatible, and we can certainly have different opinions or disagree, and then just keep right on going and have a good discussion. It's not necessary to take the time to raise your hand and unmute and blah, blah, blah. It just slows it down. So we are going to get started. Norma Kilalea is one of the first people that I ever met when I moved to Holland. And she is a good friend. All of you know that she's very famous now for being on the front page of the Sentinel at the protest on Sunday. And so she has been kind enough to come to our meeting today of nonfiction books and to lead the discussion. We are looking forward to it. Let me just say one more thing, okay? At the end, and whenever we're finished talking, it doesn't matter if it's 11 o'clock or not, whenever. I will tell you about the books for next semester in the what's called WISP, Winter Spring. So welcome to you all. There may be more people joining us from time to time, but please enjoy the discussion, and please, everybody, speak up and share your thoughts. Thank you very much. Hi, Norma.
Hi, Diana. Thanks so much for the introduction. And I told Diana just a bit ago that my caveat is that I felt the issues surrounding the protest were important, and that certainly got me there. I'm not in my comfort zone being on the front page of the Sentinel. So I'm just glad to be with friends again today. I hope you all really did enjoy the book. It seemed to me as I read it that it did shed new light on a period in our history that we anguish about and have read a great deal about and keep looking for implications for current political activity. It also was just an intimate story of family and the beauty of family relationships. And as I saw it, the cunning and the courage that this family required, and eventually, of course, needing to endure a great deal of pain, as so many families at that time did. So I'm anxious to get started, just to hear your thoughts about the book, and I do hope that we hear from everybody. And the first, the first thought that came to me is, what, if anything, did you learn from reading this book that was new to you, new information about this period of time in world history? Anybody want to jump in and get started on thoughts about new things that you might have noticed?
Well, this is Tom. I know I can't be seen here, but I have a good friend who's a Czech, and I never really knew how much Czechoslovakia suffered under Nazi rule. It's a whole new window into just how pervasive these Nazis were and what the Jews had to do to cope with them. And what a bunch of interesting people in this book.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I felt the same way, Norma. I was intrigued by this Terezin, the interim camp, and realizing how people set up a second life there actually. And it almost felt like, well, they're going to be there. They're going to be okay. And then the horrible transition to Auschwitz. But I had no idea either about the involvement in Czechoslovakia. And of course, they were a landlocked country. So it was difficult for them to think about, getting away. And it was a fascinating book. And I learned
Yeah.
a lot about it, yes, from the camp. I thought that was a really good part of it.
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
me.
Terry, this is Diana. Can I ask you something? I was also just very surprised and very struck by the idea of an interim little city, Terezin, that seemed, it seemed like a Potemkin village. And I was appalled that when the UN inspectors came,
Yes.
they were fooled by the Nazis. Did that strike you as odd, or what about that?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting when the Red Cross came, and they were prepared. It was almost like a joint commission visit in the hospital, Norma. You get ready, someone is coming. And they looked really good to everyone, and just realizing what was going to happen later. That was a very right. I thought everything was going to be idyllic. It sounded like it's great for them and they were going to be fine. And then the horror of being transported to Auschwitz. Yes, it was fascinating. I did not know that. Yes.
It was also so interesting that Lotar's wife could actually go inside the camp to drop things off for the family members a couple of times. So clearly people workers were going in and out of that camp, and she was able to mix in with that. And just imagine the courage that took, in
Yes.
addition to all the other things that the family members and other family members
Right.
endured.
Well, I think there are some very strong women with Lotar and both Zdenka and Mila. And I mean, really, they, excuse me, sustained that family, especially Zdenka. And the fact that she
Yeah.
wasn't Jewish and was able to move so freely in Czechoslovakia. But she took a lot of risks, but she was a daring person.
Yeah, she was my favorite character in the whole
Yes,
book. I have to
yes, I
say, if
agree.
you met her, I'd love to really meet her. You know what I mean? She was
Yes.
really an impressive woman.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually in Prague several years ago and did go to that Jewish synagogue, and you could see all of the names on the wall. So reading about that was really interesting. And that family actually went back and found his name with the question mark. And, it just sort of gave you chills when you thought that you had been at that same place, or I'd been there. It was a very interesting book.
I had
didn't-
occasion, I had occasion to go to Terezin in '96, and I went through the well, actually the camp is a little bit outside of the town now. It's about a mile or 2 miles away. But when I visited, we went to the museums and we saw the artwork that the inhabitants had done. And I was struck that it was positive and upbeat. Most of the artwork, and especially that was done, was positive. And that just surprised me so much that it didn't dwell on the awful part of living there.
Was the camp Terezin still in existence?
Oh, well, it wasn't used, but it's, of course, there for people to see what it was like. And it's
Aha.
just as it was described. Right now, they have graves like that cover a large part and with the names of the people who were buried there. And then they have 2 museums, and one of them shows what the accommodations were for the people there.
Uh-huh.
Yes, it's still there in existence for people to visit.
Wow. And that, at least in my previous reading, it seems like all of what I had read was broad sweep stuff and a lot of emphasis on Auschwitz and the extermination camps. And I hadn't read about places like this that were, as it would appear, initially set up to bring in forced labor, but to do work that was helpful to the Germans. And so this was another layer for me as well.
It was kind of like a triage center would be for a hospital, I think, to sort people out as to whether they could be useful or not.
Yes. I'm struck by your comment about some of the positive writings that you saw. And I think back to the place in the book where Otto is describing his horror about how those conditions forced people to do things to one another, that it kind of extinguished any generosity and forced people to do things just to survive. At the same time, and one of my other questions was about what strengths we saw in this family, and people have mentioned Zdenka in particular, but just the fact, and Ella showed tremendous strength too. When I think about Ella, for example, in that camp, and she had to go alone because at that point she was sent ahead, but she was able somehow to form relationships so that she cooked and cleaned for the engineer in the camp, which eventually really provided extra means for Otto. She got him a certificate so that he could do certain things. And so Ella's self-confidence and her ability to form relationships was evident to me as she operated in that camp, both for her own well-being and then to get Otto a certificate, which probably allowed them to stay in the camp longer before being transported to Auschwitz.
Which I think points up to this.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it points up to the strategic planning and thoughtfulness that all of these people evidenced, from the hair dye to make Otto look younger, to thinking about how do I help my husband given this circumstance, and all the plotting and the planning. I mean, that's a higher level critical thinking than most of us do, but it points to the fact that in crisis, we all can step forward.
Yeah.
I wondered about what you all thought, because we'll never know the answer and there's no way to know the answer. But reading between the lines, it seemed to me Otto suspected, and there was reason to think that possibly Ella had to have sexual relations with some of her captors in order to get the kinds of favors that she did. I certainly don't blame her, and God knows what any of us would have done. But did you all have that impression or not?
Well,
I did.
thought-
Yes,
I did. I thought he was jealous. I'm not sure that she actually did, because she was pretty sly. but she was coy and was able to think, but her husband was very jealous of that relationship, and that created kind of a rift a little bit in their marriage, I think. But I think she did what she had to do to get food and things, but
Right.
it's we have to realize the circumstances, but I think she was pretty sly and able to maneuver herself pretty well. But anyway, but certainly did cause some jealousy there.
Yeah, we'll never know. But again, even before they were in the camp, she was a very outgoing person, loved her family. Remember, she bought the house because she wanted them to be in the country and have fun and cook for her family. So she was just a sparkly, outgoing person. And I can see her integrating herself into the people in the camp and finding ways, as Sue mentioned, to do things. And Diana mentioned that. But we will never know exactly to what extent. Maybe there was a fondness for someone, but we don't know where. But it's a good question, a thought.
Yeah, she denied special relationship with this engineer Lunger when Otto brought it up, but
Well,
it certainly is a possibility.
Mhm.
And the other thing that was so fascinating, of course, was that the family was very realistic about sending food, sending money, finding ways to get those resources so that Otto and Ella could bribe and could get not only build relationships within the camp, but also bribe for things that they needed. I mean, this family was loving, but also just so realistic. And you're right, Zdenka. Think about those 2 times when she disguised herself, left the bike in the barn, and then mixed with the people working in the fields, and then walked into the camp back with them and found Ella. And I thought, oh, what courage. What courage.
Yeah, she was amazing when she set up the false raid towards the end, and I was at 44, 45. She got a German on the street to come in and raid their apartment and pretend that Lothar was going to be taken away, and they were hiding, and he had the cyanide capsule, and she said, "I'm not going to bite into that capsule. Hold off, hold off." And then remember when they were at the top level, the 5th floor, and they were on the 6th floor, the Germans then went away. But that was just amazing how she just refused to give in. Yeah.
Yes.
It's exciting. Yeah.
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 And the pattern that Lothar and Hans and Zdenka had, but of having cyanide capsules in their mouth. I mean, the terror of what would be done to them was just something.
I remember reading about Hans on the train with a
Yes.
cyanide capsule in his mouth, and he's a young man, and it just gave me chills to think about that, because I might get scared and just bite on it because I was fearful rather than, it just was terrifying. I think you'd have
Yeah.
you that close to death, and if you made a mistake at all, it was over. But anyway,
Yeah.
that I thought the other part that was interesting was Zdenka. The marriage didn't last after the war was over. And I
Mhm.
thought that was kind of a sad. I mean, she moved on to some different things, but she had done so much for that family, and there was such a closeness there. But maybe there was just so much trauma that they just couldn't sustain that relationship afterwards. But I thought that was a sad part of the story.
And yet at the far end of the story, I'm trying to remember the details, but Zdenka comes back. I mean, she is back in a relationship. She and the daughter she had with second husband, but she was back in a
Victor.
relationship.
Right. They remained friends, and
Yeah.
then they decided, because Lothar had Parkinson's. And I remember they remained friends, but then they decided it probably wasn't a good idea. I think that was like 1970. But I wonder too why in the chapter about her they didn't thank her, or the daughter didn't say a lot about it in that way. I mean, and she really helped that family. But then I could see at the end how relationship changed, and how it was difficult to go on, and perhaps that's why it just wasn't discussed. But
Yeah. There is mention in the book also about how Lothar, and Lothar is the older brother, but that he at times was ill, almost too ill to work, because he was experiencing such anguish and feeling responsibility for things going on. And of course, Hans later on, what with the hiding and then all of that covert action to get into Berlin,
Oh,
and having to fight fires during the bombing, and then coming back and having seen his mother go on that transport. And she mentions that when they went back to that station at, is it Bubny? Somebody can correct me if I've got the
correct,
word.
you're correct, Bubny.
Bubny.
Yeah.
Yeah, that, you know, that he just totally broke down, and she could see that in him. And I think, boy, talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's no wonder that relationships were difficult. And he had the relationship with her mother, and it was almost as if in Venezuela, it was an entirely new life for them, and he could block out what had happened previously. Did anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think you could block out some things, you know, when they both brothers arrived, it talks about how they totally immersed themselves in the Venezuelan culture, learned Spanish quickly, became philanthropists. Hans married very well. The second time was someone I think that was in sort of Venezuelan society, but they both jumped in right away, entrepreneurs, getting a business started. And I think a lot of that was just blocking out. This is not, like Hans said, it's a new life when he's talking to his daughter and some of his correspondence, and he just didn't want to talk about. But I was amazed how much information she found later after his death. At first you thought he didn't record anything, but there was a lot of stuff in that little box. So
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
just
what a
seemed,
gift for Tim to leave that box for his daughter, because finally she would get the key to all of it. And if she didn't receive that box, she would never have known. I mean, that was such a gift to her and to the rest
Yes.
of the family. She could really connect with her roots. And, you know, I thought that was really giving.
Yes, right.
yeah, he clearly had to just shut the door on the past, at least during his waking hours. It was interesting that the nightmares still came quite
Yes.
violently. And, you know, well, it's a lot of World War II veterans are the same way, though. They would never talk about their experiences during the war either. They just really had to shut that off. It was traumatic. And my paternal grandfather was an Irish orphan who was brought over to Canada as a young man, like or adolescent, 13 or so. And he never talked about any of his early life either. We have no record whatsoever. That's why I'm at least envious that Ariana Newman had some details to go on. But then again, the nightmares, my grandfather would have these terrible nightmares. They were so bad, he told my grandmother to poke him with a broomstick or something rather than trying to wake him up with her hand because he was afraid he would strike her. So, you know, it's just, it's fascinating, you know, how people do learn to accommodate and overcome the stress, maybe not in the best way, but at least to keep it manageable.
I was also interested, and I'm interested in any comments about one of the things that I thought about as I read was that was a developing power within the Nazi regime, and how, for example, it was in 1936 that Otto was, I think, like 46 and Ella was 42. And within a few years after that, you know, actions in Germany had begun. There were Jewish people from Czechoslovakia who were fleeing. Otto's brother Victor pleads with him to leave Czechoslovakia and come to the US. At the same time, another of the family was saying, well, business isn't so good, but we're doing all right. You know, there was, I get the sense that they were aware of things going on. And of course, I think it was in 1938 that they made application at the US Embassy in Prague, and were designated as non-quota. And so they were not approved. But I felt like I was seeing some clues that they were quite aware of the seriousness of some of the things going on, but they also had their own life, and they had some life that they kept hoping was going to be all right. Did anybody have any thoughts about their reaction to events around them at that, at that early time?
I think that they didn't realize what was, you deny things for so long because it can't be happening.
Yeah.
And he was an important man. He had a business. It was important business. They were respected in their community and so forth. And how do you accept those things? You kind of block them out. And at that time too, what was the policy of the US for allowing Jewish immigration to it here? It was shut down a lot. So that gave them limited access to entry into the United States at that time too, which I'm sure they had reasons for it, but they don't make sense once you're in the background and looking at them then, but you weren't there at the time. So it's hard to know.
I think things were going so well for them, living in the city with their business, and they loved that country place. It was an idyllic life. And I just kept thinking they seemed to be unscathed, things just didn't seem to happen to them. And I don't know, I mean, of course, Hans, or was it Lutar? Lutar had to leave school. There was a note on his desk say that he couldn't return to school. Little things were happening, but they seemed to be bypassing them. And of course, the quota for the United States, they said, was something like 25,000 visas per year. So if you didn't meet that, then you could not. And they just never were able to get in. But do you think also because of their intellect, the technology background and their company, that those things sort of helped them survive too? I mean, they were very clever at figuring out like the passport and everything else. And
yes,
a farmer working on a farm, would they be able to do things like that? They were just really intriguing. It was sort of like a spy story in a way, how they figured out things. But I think they knew, but since they weren't affected, maybe that happens to a lot of us. We know, but well, it's not about us, and so we continue on.
But I also think that sometimes things change so slowly. You hope that somehow the political process or the good people will prevail. So you just go, oh, this is awful. This is awful, but this is awful. But somehow there's always the hope. I don't think hindsight, it's a lot easier to look back and say, well, I should have, or we should have gotten out when we had a chance. But I think you are always, I find I'm hopeful for the better outcome when I look around and see things that are happening that I just can't believe even today. So it's hard to, I guess I understand that it's going to get better, or someone's going to intervene and we're going to, become who we really want to be. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah.
And PBS, I want to, during the past 5 weeks, I was able to see 2 of the sessions that PBS had on the rise of Hitler during this period. And I was struck in some ways, maybe because my own history has real sense of history, has real gaps, but the essence that I picked up from these sessions on PBS was that the movement after World War I began rather gradually, but was very steadily. You know, one was the Paris Agreement, where the penalty sanctions against Germany for World War I were very heavy on the nation. And so there was both real economic damage and damage to the pride. And at the same time, the Reichstag, the parliamentary, and the von Hayden, is it, who was the premier in Germany at that point, were both rather weak institutions and were not managing some of the demands on the country and the economic damage that happened after World War I. And that series described some of the early manipulations that Hitler was able to accommodate. There were two others that were mentioned as seeking to have more power, and they had tensions between communists and academics, and then this far right, the far right movement that Hitler, of course, was developing. And so, you know, I think even early after World War I, I'm struck with the early developments that resulted in changes in Germany. And then, of course, they're moving into surrounding countries. But there were many clues, Sharon, as we look in retrospect, that I think we can see now. But people, particularly in difficult economic times, may not have the luxury of thinking about the political implications of some of the things that were happening.
Though they actually jailed Hitler for 2 years for his early things, but while he was in jail, he read Das Kapital and Karl Marx, and he strategized even more for what he was going to do in the future. So it was interesting. Even though he served that jail time, it kind of gave him more time to kind of plan his onslaught. And it's interesting, the charisma he had for the people. I was in Nuremberg, and that was a city that he had a lot of rallies and things. So they have a huge museum there, the history of the development of Nazism from the very beginning of his being in jail and the rabble rousing he did, and then trying to stop him, and then going forward. And he was such a powerful speaker and promised so much to people and gave them hope of a future. And everything was about Lebensraum. We need room to live. And it was kind of like in America, we need to move west. We need more space. We need to develop more. And it's interesting. And I've been in Germany several times, and they really have a lot of museums dedicated to what went wrong and trying to hope that that never happens again. And the same thing at Dachau. I went to Dachau outside of Salzburg, and it's a whole camp as it was. Now this was in 1968, so this is a long time ago, but you could see the buildings, and they had videos and films of what went on there. And I think the German people have really made an effort to remember what went wrong and hope that it never ever happens again in their society. So it's an interesting thing. And I think even what's happening in our country right now, who would have thought we would have the Electoral College finish voting and yet have a president that wouldn't secede and turn over? So society we all get stressed, and how we respond to this is going to be interesting, because I think we're experiencing some of that in our own time, and it'll be interesting how we manage to move forward and come together again as a country and continue our democracy.
Yeah. Your comment about Hitler's speaking skill was brought forward in that PBS series. And I was surprised. They talked about the fact that he was, we see this harsh man, but he, particularly early in his work, was very promising to people about a better Germany. He would bring better things to them. He was able to relate to, or he made a point of relating to children and families. And so he put himself forward in a very positive light, which would certainly have influenced people at a time when they were going through great difficulties.
Well, and I think
Could
too,
have had a
Norma,
Make Germany Great Again hat. Sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was
Oh,
just gonna say, he
all
could
I-
have had a MAGA hat that said "Make Germany Great Again" because he was all about the throwback to the great German past. I will bring it back again. Go ahead.
Yes, yes.
Oh, and I was just going to make a short comment that a lot of Americans, and certainly a lot of young Americans, do not realize that Hitler was elected, democratically elected in the beginning, and then he seized more and more power. But they did vote for him for all the reasons Norma just outlined.
Yes, yes. I have to share a story too that is a little bit divergent from Hitler, but I had this dear neighbor where I currently live, Magdalena. Magdalena was 78 when I got to know her, and she would always walk in the block and then stand and talk and so forth. And among the stories that she shared, Magdalena grew up in Romania and talked about the time that her father was impressed by Hitler and forced to go to work, as the book described, forced to go to work in German plants. And her mother was left with Magdalena, and a younger brother. And at one point, for their safety, they were in a wagon and a horse, and with some other families, feeling they needed to flee from the area where they had lived. And she speaks about the fact that they learned that there were Russians in the area and that they were coming toward the camp of these women with the wagons and the young children. And she said her mother was fearful that the Russian soldiers, who had a reputation for taking young girls for their pleasure, and she had Magdalena hide herself and her little brother under a back seat in the wagon. And she took a bottle and broke it. And when a Russian soldier came wanting to look in the wagon, she drove this bottle that was, broken glass. She drove this bottle into the Russian's body. And she said, and then we took off. And Magdalena, here's this sweet, dear 78-year-old lady telling me these stories, which were so true. And I think about the fact that Hans and Lothar and Mila left Prague in the end, even though they had gone back after they were allowed. But they left Prague at a time when the communists when the Russians were coming in and were being nihilistic and difficult, and they felt they had to, and that was the point at which they left forever. But it reminded me of this story of Magdalena and her mother and a few women fleeing from the area where they had lived, in this graphic picture of how she was able and did defend her family. I'll never forget this. But it just impresses me with the harsh conditions that Central European area has had to live through for so many years. It's amazing.
I think one of the amazing things about the book, and I just like to hear others' reactions. We're all in our 70s now or something like that, and none of us can even imagine or recapture what it would have been like at the time that our parents were young, and yet she does that so well. That just amazed me about the book, to be able to go back and transport us as readers to another place and time that was real. All of it was a real story, but it does read like fiction a lot of the time.
In the New York Times review, one of the first questions that they asked was, did you feel like this was fiction or nonfiction? And of course, it was nonfiction, but you're right, her storytelling skills are superb. And it does almost feel like a fictional story.
It's very descriptive when she talks about her grandfather Otto going into the gas chamber and the shoe color, the dye streaming down his face because it had rained that day. And she pictures him going into the gas chamber and his face is all black and his hair turns gray, and they discovered, I mean, that was just amazing how she described that. So she had to do a lot of very deep research. It seemed it took her quite a bit of time to get a lot of those letters translated. But it was very descriptive. And at first I thought, is this a novel or is this nonfiction? But she just really has a way of bringing out things that, so vivid. Yes.
And it seems to me that she had found one person who was in Auschwitz, in the camp at the time, that survived. I mean, she even had that description of a German soldier striking Otto with the butt of his gun. And of course, I thought for a person like Otto, who was a strong person, a bright person, how horrible. I mean, not only, of course, the gas chamber, but the treatment at that time, just debilitating.
As far as judging whether this is fiction or nonfiction, of course, it's history, but it's history in the terms of what she interpreted from things with good background, but it's like a historical drama on you view on television. It's still not the actual on the scene going on thing. It's her interpretation through bits of information she's gotten, which really was hard and sketchy to put together. She did a marvelous job.
Yeah.
I read several reviews, and it really is telling its memoir, and it really the finest example, and her writing skills are so good. I looked her up and I couldn't find anything online about her education or her background or very much at all. I thought she might be in Wikipedia or something, but she doesn't seem to have anything listed. I did find a website. It's a Israeli newspaper, and I'll send it to Kim so she can send it out. It's actually, she has a YouTube video talking about the book, and then she has all kinds of clips of pictures of she and her father and her mother growing up in Venezuela. And so I think that'll be really interesting. It's about a 5 or 6 minute little video that she's put together. And it was interesting, but it was hard to find about her background because she's such a wonderful writer.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
actually, if you look in the back of the book,
Right.
it gives who she was on the flyleaf cover and her education. She lives in London at this point in time, but you know, it gives all the information on there.
Right. She graduated from Tufts University.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
And then she had a dual degree in history and French, and then she had a master's degree in Spanish and Latin American literature. So,
I
well,
guess I read
another
the book
post
about,
degree.
yeah, I read the book about 6 weeks ago, and I was a library book, so I had to turn it back in. So then last night when I was trying to figure it out,
Okay,
I written it down when I read it, but I sometimes I read a lot, and then it's one book gets superimposed on the next one and the next one, and it's hard to keep track. But anyway, what a wonderful writer. It's,
Well, and I think she had the advantage, Terrazon is still exists. So she was able to go back to that town and see, some of the other concentration camps you're just seeing where they were, but this one still has barracks and still has the crematorium. I mean, they didn't kill people there, but when they were died, they in a field of graves. I went there 2 years ago, and it was very moving. They have an amazing museum. And in that museum, I'll even see my picture here. So I'm not just a talking name. Now I'm a talking ugly head. But the museum had some the children that were there. I remember one of the most poignant places was this wall of poetry that was written by the children that were there, and trying to just sort of depict their normal life, and then the statement of which children were then sent on the trains to other camps where who knows what happened to them, but there was so much of and the town still exists, and it is, I think she described it in the book at one place, how it was just sort of half a town. It's sort of silent. There's still people living there, but no one really has come back to make that town a vibrant community anymore. There's hollowness to it, but so she would have had that emotional experience of being where her grandparents were, and
right.
yeah. So I thought that was it was a moving experience for me without any connection at all.
yeah.
I thought her research was truly amazing, and how many lucky finds she was able to make, all these connections through family, and suddenly somebody would remember there was a box in the attic and send it off to her and so forth. It was just remarkable how it all came together. And then the additional research of going to the company in Berlin, that the record still existed of that company that Hans worked for in Berlin, so she could trace some of that and look through old Berlin phone books and on and on. It just was absolutely fascinating to me how she put that all together, and the years that she spent doing it all, and the hours and hours it must have taken.
What about Ariana finding herself when she went to college in the United States and was approached by a Mexican gentleman who said, well, you're Jewish, your name is Jewish. And she didn't know that. And so she was struck by her history right there and couldn't back it up. And when she tried to approach her father about it, it got her very little.
Where is the place where she was with her father and she saw his name with a question mark?
That's at the synagogue in Prague.
Oh, okay.
They have a name of all the people that were lost from Prague, and that and their dates of birth and death. And his birth date was there, but then a question mark because they didn't know what happened to him. He disappeared, and so that was yeah. And that's that. I saw that too when I was there. It's really just moving. Many names on the side of the synagogue, and it's in their courtyard, sort of.
I guess Prague was one of the few towns in the beautiful old towns that didn't get bombed to nothing in World War II. So it still has a beautiful Baroque downtown and everything. I always wanted to go there, but haven't been.
Any thoughts about as we review this family with enormous strengths and love and cunning, but also the events that were occurring? Any implications? Did you feel like there were implications for our life now?
Well, I know democracy's not safe because it's these strongmen are taking over in Brazil and all around the world. We're seeing people kind of flout democracy and go on populist sentiment and rah, rah, rah. So it shows us we have to keep a democracy safe because the rails can go off anytime and we have to be alert to it.
Right.
It was interesting to me that Venezuela was, played the role that it did in this book. And particularly when you think about Chavez and Maduro and current events in Venezuela, the potential, for a country that has the largest oil reserves in the world, and yet the mismanagement and implications of a poor governing structure, and that country is just in horrible conditions right now, despite all of that. And so it is it's not that that country was a strong democracy before, but there was certainly potential for a country to provide for its citizens, and has been just so wasted. And elections there certainly were in doubt. And so it's a reminder that things can change
Quickly.
There's
Yeah.
an interesting series on Netflix right now called High Seas, and it's a Spanish series, and it's about a German family or a Spanish family leaving Spain to go to Venezuela. And it turns out that the parents owned a shoe company, but they were leasing their trucks to the Germans to deport people to the camps and to the extermination camps. And so they're trying to flee with the gold bullion. But we talked about the Jews in Spain and leaving, and it's a very interesting series, and it kind of ties into all of what we've been talking about. It's very interesting to see the machinations of the people on the other side trying to get away from being tried for their misdeeds and leaving to go to South America. And here we had the people that were being mistreated going to South America to build a better life. So it kind of worked both ways, it looks like.
It's just so horrifying how racism and violence against the other is normalized or was normalized during the Nazi period. And, that too could really happen again. I mean, we have instances of that in our own country, certainly in our history. And it's frightening in a way that it's easy for that to happen.
Well, over the weekend, the Black churches in Atlanta were vandalized. And that just happened in our country right now. And the Black Lives Matter banners were taken, the church were vandalized outside. So no, it happens almost every day somewhere. And I think even in our own country.
and demonizing persons who are not like us, which I think currently concerns for some of the rhetoric of the far right, we can certainly feel has similarities to what we saw happening in Germany, and was subtle maybe, and people thought, well, we're all right, and didn't act on it. And it just has, to me, the book had strong implications in that regard as well.
When I was in 6th grade, we had a history teacher who said, if we ever get fascism in America, it'll be red, white, and blue, and apple pie and baseball, and you'll just love it. And I've lived through a lot of Republican presidents, but never had one who kowtowed to the Nazis and the Proud Boys and all the other weirdos who live on the fringe of our society. He actually got along with these people, and no Republican president ever even admitted they existed, much less endorsed them. So that was a scary thing about this presidency.
Yeah, I just misspoke though. Those were the churches in Washington DC, not in Atlanta. It was an African Methodist church and an AM and an E church that were damaged over the weekend. So you had to get the right locale here.
But speaking of other, I, was raised in Wisconsin, all white, all, well, probably Catholics and Protestants were the two that were the others when I was a kid, but went to university and always was a supporter of integration because I believed that that was the best course for our very diverse democracy. And now I've come to see that all my life, thinking that integration was the answer is racist. And it's racist because if you assume integration, you assume integration into your society, your culture, your whatever, your religion. And so you are asking others who are the other to give up their culture, their music, their history, and integrate into your way of life. And so I now, here I am, 79, I'm still learning things. And I have learned that all these years I've been wrong. It's integration, you must think of as the white person's way of, again, dominating. So, I love reading books like this that keep my mind opening more and more and more. So thanks, Norma.
Yeah.
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
This is the other Marty.
Hi, Marty.
I'm in the process of reading a book called The Different Mirror. It's a history of multicultural America, and it's by Ronald Takaki. And it addresses just some of the things that you're talking about, the different races, nationalities, religions, and their history here in the country and our lack of recognition of their history. But you're speaking of, yes, everyone must be assimilated, is certainly true of the Indians that are in this, and how they felt for the betterment that they need to become farmers and join society. On personal note, my grandfather taught at an Indian school in Oklahoma for 2 years. Unfortunately, I never thought to talk to him about it, but he was an industrial arts teacher, and that goes right along with the curriculum that they're discussing that these Indians need. So anyway, it's a very good book.
And the author again?
Ronald, and then Takaki.
Okay. And in some ways, a lot of what I have read recently too is a reminder that there is what we used to call consciousness raising about some of these issues. There's a greater recognition, maybe through protest, maybe through other things happening. There's a greater consciousness in the country right now, and a hope that that simply doesn't dissipate. That in fact we are able to make some changes and some improvements in our democratic governance.
Now, I'd like to hear from some of the people who haven't. I mean, I talk all the time. I'm so sorry, but I just would love to hear from a few people that have not spoken up is, I wonder if we could sort of go around and, are there things you wished you had asked your grandparents? Not me.
If there's no answer to that, I would like to talk about the title of the book and all of the references to time all the way through the book, from the beginning where she sees her father working in his workshop all the time with the clocks or watches, and with the different watches that she realized that he had, and how one of them was special to him because his father wore it, or it reminded him of the one his father wore all the time. And then to where I think the title of the book came from, when Hans was in hiding in the factory in Montana, at the Montana paint factory, waiting to become Jan from Hans, and how the time went so slowly when it would be time for him to get on the train and go to Berlin. I just thought that the title of the book and all of her references to time made for a very well thought out and organized book.
Well, I also like the title too, because there's actually several layers to the title. There's
Yes.
absolutely the actual mechanism of the time, and that time, hiding in the paint factory. But then for her, time stopped as she was exploring and delving into her history. So I thought it was a marvelous title, because there's so many layers to it. And I think all those layers are reflected in her writing and in the book. So I'm Marty, I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's a very significant piece of her excellent writing.
Yep.
Mhm.
And it was
I
so
thought
amazing.
today,
Go
I
ahead.
thought today about the time standing still, and I felt, well, this is hitting us personally as we become seniors, because you don't have a schedule necessarily to follow, and time is warped, and you find yourself staying up later or going to bed at strange times, or relegating your time to different things because you don't have a basis necessarily. I thank God for classes like this that get me so that I'm aware of time. Otherwise, I don't necessarily think about it at all.
I just was amazed when he took his watch apart, was able to put it back together again. I don't know how complex, if you've ever taken a watch apart, but it's so complex. So he was this amazing man with his intellect, because to take a watch apart in this box and then put it back together again. And I love the way she tied it together too throughout the things, and how time was so important to him the rest of his life, that even in Venezuela, when everybody else came in half an hour late to a cocktail party, he always appeared on time. So she tied that theme together throughout the story, and it was
Right.
it was really wonderful, and how time was so important to him throughout
Right.
his life.
But time changed him too. Initially, remember in the story, he was always late for
He was
curfew,
awful.
never there on time
Right.
for dinner. And then all of a sudden now, as all these things evolved in his life, time came critical. Didn't he repair or take the watch apart when he was in hiding in the factory,
Mhm.
when he was by himself to sort of have something to do? He started looking at the watch. I thought that's how
Yeah,
it
that was
started.
the first time, I think, when he was in
Yeah.
that box, and then
Right.
because he thought maybe his watch wasn't working because
Mhm.
it was moving so slowly, so he took
Yep.
it all apart and put it back together again, which was just incredible. I don't think he had, you think of all those little watch tools people have and stuff, to be able to take it apart and make it work again was pretty amazing.
No, it was a good title. I agree to the book. That was just how she tied so many events together based on timing on the train. And when Hans went to get his passport to go back to, was it Prague, and how he sort of coerced the clerk, watching the clerk, timing himself to go to the right clerk, to almost a
Yes.
threat, like you make sure you have to fill this out. I mean, that was taking a chance, but all that was timing. The right person was there. It was really, I could see the title fitting in so well to all the events.
Yeah. And a theme of recognition of time in a way. I think back to that story about, and you were mentioning, Terry, about when Hans was a young person, 16, 17, he was more poetic, and he was always late. And he came in to dinner one time, and his father had put, and Otto had put his watch on Hans' dinner plate. And that's, nothing was said, but a theme of this, of a family that was very cognizant about the importance of time.
Yes.
I think it's really interesting how questions of identity run through the whole book as well. Your family identity, your ethnic identity, and then of course all the shifting identities, and how that affects your life in so many ways, and pretending to be someone else. And that was fascinating how she explored all of that too.
And the attitudes of the family, they were impressed upon because they were Jewish. And yet, for example, Zdenka found favor and was compatible with the family. And she was from a family that did not really approve of her relationship with Lothar, but she was very comfortable with his Jewishness. And so you get the feeling that the family did not have those kind of tight exclusions about people. They were a family that was comfortable with people. And that was evidenced by Zdenka's incorporation into the family.
Right, and they didn't practice a lot of the Jewish traditions. And remember, two of the family, Ella and the boys, were actually baptized.
Yes.
This is another protection, but they really didn't, as Zdenka told her family, they really, Lotar's family did not practice all the traditions of the Jewish faith. Well, how I read it.
The boys were not circumcised, which was actually, for Hans in particular, that would have been a key to his survival in Berlin. I mean, he would have stood out in the restroom.
That's correct.
If he had been circumcised.
Right, Sarah.
So that was remarkable. Again, one of those bizarre things, good fortune as it turned out.
Yeah. Yes, there were instances of luck, if you will, like Hans being able to pick the one agent that he needed to get papers to return to Prague. And what was I thinking about? What Ella, but some of the things that Ella did as well that were in some ways just, it seemed like, or the fact that she fainted on the train and was taken off. So it was cunning and courage and intelligence and love, but there was some luck in there as well.
Absolutely. I was amazed when they took her off the train because she fainted, and the cruelty of the Nazis. I thought, well, they'll just leave her in the ditch, but they didn't. They took her to Terezin, or she would have been in Auschwitz a lot sooner.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Anything else on anybody else's comments about implications for today's USA?
I guess I would just say, despite the fact we still have a lot of problems, anti-Semitism has, there's not as much anti-Semitism in this country, even though it still exists, in my view, as it was when I was a kid. And certainly not as much anti-Semitism as there was at the time of World War II, because there was discussion earlier about the State Department not allowing many Jews into this country. Well, that was because there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the State Department. I think that's a historical fact. It's not just my opinion. So that wouldn't, and I have to think if there was something going on in the world that was as bad as the Holocaust. Well, I think we still have some nativism in this country, but I think, and a lot of it's directed at Muslims and Mexicans, but I still think we've come a ways in the positive direction from when I was a kid, or, you know, talking to my dad and mother who were alive in the 1930s. They're both deceased now, but they said that there was a lot of anti-Semitism in this country then. And my dad's father, even though my dad was raised Catholic, my dad's father was Jewish. And and actually he and his family visited Europe before World War II, and they didn't go to Germany because this was the late 30s. You know, it was a very hostile environment to Jews at that point. So the Holocaust was the final solution, but there was a lot of anti-Semitism that went, you know, way back with Hitler and the German people and Christianity. Let's face it. I think most of us, if not all of us, are Christians on this call, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the history of the Catholic Church. I'm a Catholic, and Christianity.
Yeah.
And people just didn't care enough about Jews getting murdered, including, you know, there's some questions why didn't Franklin Roosevelt order the bombing of the railroads so that you could take people to Auschwitz. You know, Franklin Roosevelt was a great president, but he was far from perfect. You know, we had our own concentration camps for Japanese Americans.
Yes.
Well, in this lecture we went to, it has the Jews in Spain. The professor was very interesting because at the end of the lecture, she said, there will always be others in this country. And she said, you know, even myself, I feel like an other sometimes. She is of Armenian descent, and she confessed that one of her last sentences, very softly, her voice went down. She said, there will always be others. And I have felt that way myself coming to Holland and only being here for 3 years. So we will always have others.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree our country as a whole isn't as racist and sexist and xenophobic as when we were kids? That's an anti-Semitic. I mean, we've improved.
Absolutely. Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I've seen recently a lot of ugliness. I mean, I have been in the South during the day with the separate and unequal situations of who could go where. But I think there still is. And we have to recognize that it's not just religious and ethnic, but also social segregation that we have in this country. And it's, you know, the social bit, it is what it is. But I think part of the shock of the past 4 years is having this underbelly percolate to the surface again.
Yes, that's a fair point. Yep.
Yes. Yes.
Yep, it's there. Somebody had mentioned that, I think, I can't remember who, but about not using the word integrate anymore, or maybe that was you, Diana. But the reason why I think that was viewed, I mean, when I was a kid, there was segregation, and then there was attempts to end segregation through integration, like integrating lunch counters in the South and buses and hotels. And so I hadn't actually heard that integrate had somewhat of a negative connotation. So thanks for bringing that up.
Well, I think that when we read How to Be an Anti-Racist, there are subtle distinctions that he brought out that, and I'm not recalling all of that, but Diana, that I can, as you brought that up, I can remember his talking about the fact that if we continue to think about integration, it often was from the point of view that that the others become like the major or the main body. And his concern was that we don't think that way, that we need to not think that to bring other groups in, they have to be like the majority, that's destructive.
Oh, Norma, I should have given credit to that book for changing my mind. It was the book by Ibram, How to Be an Anti-Racist, that, just altered my thinking in that way. You're right.
Yeah.
And that was one of our nonfiction book choices.
Yes. Yeah, it altered my thinking too.
How about, in addition to the two words we're discussing, the melting pot theory? I think that is a bygone. I don't think America adheres to the concept of the melting pot like we did before.
How so?
How?
I'm not sure what you mean exactly.
Yeah.
There was always the theory that when people came to the United States, they assimilated, and there was a melting pot, and this great melting pot is what has become America. America is a melting pot. And I can remember in high school discussing, is it a melting pot or is it a crazy quilt? And, with pushing our thoughts towards the fact that it is a it's a quilt rather than a melting pot. And depending upon where you live, I think some of these things are more evident. When you live in a large city, you see pockets of population, whether it's, the Catholic parishes that were all built by different nationalities. If it is the Jewish enclaves that have the string, the rope, the wire that encircles their community. Is it the street where you go to buy all your Indian and Pakistani ingredients? Or is it where you go to buy your Polish sausage? When you live in suburbs, I grew up in a suburb, this quilt is not as evident. Right. As it's more of a homogeneous community. And when we talk of us and others, whether you are in a homogeneous setting or you're in more of a quilt setting, I think can affect your thoughts on how integrated society is. But I think as a whole, I don't think we view ourselves as much as a melting pot that perhaps we did in the 50s.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, thanks.
It's an interesting picture to think about melting pot versus embracing crazy quilt versus needing melting pot, meaning all individual characteristics, individual ethnic characteristics need to be submerged into a singular. That's an interesting comparison that I'd never heard, but it's worth thinking about.
Diana, could you tell us about the books for the winter spring term and what we need to read for?
Oh, I have not been looking at the time at all. This discussion has been just great, Norma. Thank you so much for leading it. I mean, I hope everybody spoke up that wanted to, and I hope that you get the flavor from today's discussion of what nonfiction books is like. We all take turns. I'd like to thank Norma for today and Tom for last time, and invite you to join us in the winter spring. And I may have got these out of order, but the books that we'll be reading, and remember now HASP has this new policy. You can, I think, Kim will correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, but I think you can choose any nonfiction book you want to, any nonfiction book discussion you want to join, and it's only like $5. But you can also sign up and become part of our little family here and participate in our discussions, and it's really fun. We have sort of a core group, and we all love one another and love to discuss, as you can tell. The first book, or maybe not the first, but the first one of the books we're going to be reading is the Larson book about the period with Winston Churchill. It's been on a number of the best books of 2020 lists, and the name of it is escaping me right.
The
Okay,
Splendid and the Vile.
Here, The Splendid and the Vile.
Thank you.
Okay,
I
here
appreciate
we
that
go.
very much. Yeah.
No, that
So
doesn't-
you're upside down.
No, it's upside down either way, so I don't know how to make it go upside down. I
Oh,
thought if I
great. Thank you. Okay,
Good.
I have, that's one of them. Okay, then a second book that we'll be reading next semester is Cast. I hope you can see this. Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. All of you know that she's the author of The Warmth of Other Suns, about the migration of African Americans from the South to the North. And this book is also, well, not surprisingly, but she's a wonderful writer, and it has been on a number of the best book lists as well. So this is coming up. And then this is very surprising, because nonfiction books usually reads books that are like this thick. But look at this slim little volume that Marshall Elsinga is going to lead the discussion of in, let me see, we start in February, March, April. So in April, we are going to read a book called The Corporation That Changed the World: How the East India Company Shaped the Modern Multinational. So it's a, you know, as you can see, much smaller than our usual, but it's about the East Indian Corporation. Some of you may have seen Beecham House on PBS recently. It ran on Masterpiece Theater, and the main character in that series was a former employee of the East India Company, which has influenced the whole thinking. And right now, there's a great deal of controversy about multinational corporations like, you know, Google and Facebook, and how they are taking over the world. So maybe there'll be some implications for the court cases that we see coming. Anyway, it's 11 o'clock already. I can't believe it. And I want to particularly again thank Norma, and thank you all for participating. And I know Marty's been working just to death, working on the catalog that we're all going to receive pretty soon in the mail. So I hope I'll see you in winter, spring. Thanks, everybody.
Now, I have a
Thanks.
question.
Thank you.
I have a question. I couldn't
Yes.
find virtual